Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this edition of Investigation Bible. I am Bill Kaufman, your biblical investigator, and we're now 10:8 on this episode. Okay, well, this episode will be dealing with a topic that I have been asked about many times, and recently got asked about specifically by one person, and he actually asked me to do a podcast on it. He said, "Well, Bill, why don't you do one of these for your podcast?" And I said, "Yeah, that's a good idea." And that question is the Bible translations. Why do we have them? Why do we have so many? Is there one better than another? All that kind of stuff. And I went through a long discussion with him. He asked a lot of questions. They were very pertinent questions, very good questions. And that's what prompted this particular episode, the Bible. Now, in my very first episode, we talked about what it is. It's a collection of 66 books, 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament. Old Testament was written in Hebrew, New Testament was written in Greek. There are some Aramaic, Akkadian language in Daniel in addition to the Hebrew, but it's just a few verses, and that's for a purpose. And so, but basically it's Hebrew and Greek, all right? And we talked about that in the first episode. If you ever want to watch the first episode, I go into it a lot more in depth. But that's what makes up this thing that we call the Bible, all right? The Holy Bible, the book that's set apart for God's use. Well, how do we know that what they originally wrote is what we can read today in our language? How do we know that? And that's a good question. Before I was a Christian, I actually used it as an argument to people that were believers and said, hey, how do you even know what you're reading is accurate? I mean, and I used to actually believe this, and I didn't come up with it myself. Somebody told it to me, and I said, oh yeah, that's a really good argument. It's not, by the way, but it was this. That book was probably just a written down version of an oral tradition that happened thousands of years, hundreds at least, maybe even 1,000 years before, and this oral tradition eventually got written down in some ancient language that we don't even know, and then translated into another language that we probably don't even know, and then eventually into Latin, and then into German, and then into French, and then into Spanish, and then into English. So after all those translations, there's no way you can tell what the original meant. And by the way, if that was the way it went, that would be a true statement. Here's the problem. That has nothing to do with how we got our Bible. As I just mentioned a minute ago, we do know what languages they were written down in originally. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and that was by Moses, and that was by a lot of prophets, and that was by some scribes, priests type people. Different people wrote in this thing over about a 1,500 year period of the Bible. The Old Testament was written between 1500 and 400 BC. So that is, 1,000 years roughly. And about 1,000 year period, this Old Testament was written in Hebrew. People can speak and read Hebrew. They always have been able to. They could then, they can now. Okay. There's scholars that can do this. New Testament was written over a period from about 50 to 90 AD. So about 40 years, maybe 45, but roughly that time frame. It was all written in Greek. Why was it written in Greek? Well, Greek was the common language. And why was Greek the common language of the time that the New Testament was being written, the time of the apostles and the time of Jesus even? It was because a guy named Alexander. Now, Alexander the Great lived a few hundred years before, in the 300s BC, and he conquered the world. He's a Macedonian, and his father Philip came down from Macedonia and conquered part of Greece. He finished it off, and except for they didn't attack over there, the Peloponnesian area. They did not attack the Spartans. They just left them alone. Probably a good idea. And they jumped over the Hellespont and took over, beat the Persians, and which had been an empire for quite a few years. They destroyed that empire quickly, by the way. They went down to Egypt and beat the tar out of the Egyptians, and then they went to where we have Afghanistan now. Persians would include Iraq and Iran today, but he took that over. Then he went into where Afghanistan is, beat them, went down to India. he actually had a few battles in India, and basically said there's nothing worth conquering down here. Not worth it. There's no, it's not economically a good idea. And he turned around and he came back to Shusha, which is where Esther lived, by the way, in the Old Testament, a couple hundred years before that, before his time. And Esther lived in this place called Shusha, something like that. I pronounce these words incorrectly, undoubtedly. But he lived back, or he was living there, and he died at 33 years old, very young man. And but anyway, that was Alexander the Great. Well, when he conquered the world, that's why he's known as Alexander the Great, because he conquered the world that was known at the time, And he conquered in Europe, he conquered in the Middle East, he conquered in Africa, he conquered all the way to India, and Afghanistan. He did he had this giant empire that was, held together and conquered by him. But he made all his subjects, I'm not sure it was him individually, but the Greek Empire made its subjects learn Greek. They could speak their own language. They could worship their own gods. They could teach their kids anything they really wanted to about all that stuff. They didn't care, except they added, you have to teach them Greek. And there was something that was developed over this time called Koine Greek, or Common Greek. Well, by the time that Jesus is on this earth, and by the time the disciples are around, this is what everybody does. Romans speak Greek. Carthaginians speak Greek. Persians speak Greek. Egyptians speak Greek. Everybody speaks Greek, okay, including the disciples, because had been a law, and now, even though Rome is now in charge and it's not the law, it had carried on this thing. And so everybody that was educated in any way, and by the way, they were highly educated back then. A lot of people think just because there was that time of the Dark Ages where people weren't educated, that education was only a new thing. That's not true. You go back to the time of Alexander the Great, all the way through Jesus, even after him a few hundred years, their education was quite common amongst the people. So people could read and write, and they read, and everybody, even though they had their own language, they could also understand Greek. And the New Testament was written in Greek, this Koine Greek, and sent out, and pretty much no matter what language was the language of your own people, you could also understand the Greek language. So that's how that happened. There's a Bible verse that says in the fullness of time that the Messiah was coming, the fullness of time. And I think that's part of it. That way that the gospel could be spread to all people, not just Jewish people, but to all people in a language they could all understand. And so anyway, we have thousands of copies of this New Testament written in Greek in the ancient times, And but anyway, that's neither here nor there. Translation work. Why do we need it? Well, because eventually people no longer spoke Hebrew, except for a few people. And even in the Jewish world, they weren't speaking Hebrew much anymore. And nobody was speaking Greek except for the Greeks. Eventually, after Rome was in power for a long enough time, people started learning Latin, because Latin was the language of the Romans. And even though there wasn't like an edict like there had been with Alexander in the Roman Empire, eventually people just started reading Latin. The average educated person was reading Latin. So there was something that was, they came up with the Latin version of the Old and New Testament, okay? Now, the first ones that they came up with was more of a collection. It wasn't one person's work, just a collection of these books that were considered the Bible, and it's called the Vetus Latina, okay? And that just means Old Latin. That's all it means, the Vetus Latina. So, but languages change over time. They do in English. Think about reading a Shakespeare play a few hundred years ago and then listening to English today. Okay, it's not the same. It's somewhat similar, but it's not the same. And Latin did the same thing. This is normal stuff, progression of language. So by the time that the late 300s and the early 400s show up, the church is now legal, had been legal since 320, or 312 or something like that. The church had been legal to be there. And by the time that a guy that was considered the Pope, you call him the Pope. Well, by the time he shows up, and his name is Damascus the First, Pope Damascus the First, by the time he shows up, it's 382 AD. Okay, so in 382 AD, he asks a guy named Jerome to take the Vetus Latina and put it in the common language of the people. And he did. And he translated the entire Old Testament from Hebrew, because he was brilliant. Jerome was one of those people that just smarter than everybody else. He's really good with language. And he translated the entire Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin, except for the Psalms. He did not do the Psalms. He translated them from something called the Septuagint, which was Greek. I don't know why. I actually don't know if there's an explanation. There probably is. I just don't know it. All right. But then he also translated the entire New Testament from Greek into this thing called the Latin Vulgate, or the Latin language of the people. Vulgate means vulgar, oddly enough. We think of vulgar as a bad thing now, but back then they just meant common. That's all it meant. And so it's translated into the Latin Vulgate that is still used by the Roman Catholic Church to this day, right now. I mean, that's it's gone through a few changes and everything, but basically it's still Jerome's work right now. It's still used the Latin Vulgata, and that's what's used in the Roman Catholic Church today. Now, he worked on this from the time he was commissioned by the Pope Damascus. He started in 382 and he finished in about 404. So he worked on this for 22 years, I guess. And he put a lot of work and effort into it. And we can still read his work. I think that's really great. However, what if you don't speak Latin? Because, by the way, once Latin became the language of the Romans and then the church, it stayed the language of the church. And by the way, once Latin became the language of the church, it stayed the language of the church. In fact, it wasn't until the 20th century that the Roman Catholic Church started doing services other than in Latin. Okay, that was 20th century. I mean, we're talking hundreds of years. The original people didn't do it. They didn't even speak Latin. I'm going to tell you right now, probably John or Peter didn't speak Latin. They spoke Greek, though, and Hebrew, Aramaic, but they probably didn't speak Latin. But by the time Jerome shows up, he does this. This is 400 AD. It takes off, and it's now the official work of the church. But like everything else, eventually it was no longer the common language of the day. All right. So once it stopped becoming the common language of the day, and people just started speaking their own languages. By the way, this was called the Dark Ages. People weren't that educated anymore and everything else. And it was a lot of reasons, political reasons and everything else. I don't really that's not the point. But they definitely lost their ability to read Latin. Okay, that ability was now gone. So the church was still using it, and they did all these services in this language that people couldn't even understand. Well, that bothered some people. There was a Roman Catholic priest, and he lived in Lindisfarne, which Lindisfarne is in England. It's North Newham. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. It's on the northern coast of England before you get to Scotland, and it's out in the ocean, and it's an island, and that's where this guy did this translation work in called the Lindisfarne Gospels. He did it in 715 AD, and he worked probably a little longer than that. That's when he completed it, and it is a work that took the language, the Gospels, from the original languages and put them in the common language of the people in England at the time, which wasn't English. I know. Really? Yeah, no, they didn't speak English. They spoke another language completely. The Angles and the Saxons had taken over in the 400s, so this is the 700s, and they spoke what would eventually become English, named after the Angles, and that's the reason it's called Anglish, which eventually became English. But that wasn't anything like we know today. That was a Germanic language, because the Angles and the Saxons were Germanic tribes, and they came over and conquered the Britons after the Romans left, and it's a big, long story. But nonetheless, in 700 AD, when the Lindisfarne Gospel came out, he translated it into this Anglish language, which has nothing to do with English. It's a Germanic language, but we can have it. Right? We have his copy. We have those in, we can see what his work was right now. And it's really good. But he did that so the common person could read the Gospels, because the common person couldn't read Latin. He was a Catholic priest that could read Latin, but he realized the common man couldn't, so he went and did this. We move forward a few years, and we're going to get to a guy named John Wycliffe. Now, John Wycliffe, he lived in the 1300s his whole life, okay? And in 1382 or so, he took and completed his work that was taking the Bible and translating it into the English language of his time. Now, this is in the 1300s, completely different than the Linsfairn Gospels. It's not the same language anymore, but it's also not Elizabethan language like the King James. It's an in-between. It's called Middle English. That's what it's actually called. He translated the scriptures into the common people's languages, and he lost his job over it. He was a professor at Oxford, and they fired him over doing it. They were pretty upset that he did this, but they didn't like kill him or anything. But he did die within a couple of years anyway, and of old age, fine. And so now he's gone. After him, he started this thing, and it was called the Winds of Change. That's what they called it back in his time. He started the Winds of Change so that people started wanting to read the Bible in their own languages, and not just in England, but all over the place. There was a guy named John Huss, Johannes Huss. He would be going by Johannes, but we'll call him John for our anglicized name here. Well, John Huss lived in the 1400s now, and we lived in the 1300s and the 1400s, and he translated the scriptures into his Czech languages because he was a Bavarian. He was from where we would have the Slavic peoples today, Eastern Europe. That's where he lived, and he translated the scriptures into the Czech people's languages of the thing, the Slavic languages, and they got so mad at him that in 1415 they burned him at the stake. Okay, while he was alive. That's kind of an important thing because they blamed John Wycliffe for doing this, though. See, they didn't blame just John Huss. They said this is all started because of this Wycliffe guy over in England. And they got so mad at him, the political powers that be, that they, in 1428, a few years after burning John Huss at the stake for doing this, they burned John Wycliffe at the stake. But he'd been dead for 50 years. What'd they do? Well, they uncovered, they dug up his bones, interned him, and they put him onto a stake, his bones on a stake, and they burned him, even though he'd been dead for 50 years. That's a level of hatred that is just impressive. And then they threw his bones, I guess, into the Thames River, and that's what they did. But that's what they did to John Wycliffe. Unfortunately, John Huss, he was burned alive. He was actually alive when they burned him. Going to move forward to the 1500s. And there was a guy named Tyndale, William Tyndale. Now, William Tyndale lived at the same time that Martin Luther lived, and Martin Luther, this Protestant Reformation is taking place, and he is actually an educated person from Oxford, and he's a professor at Cambridge, and he starts getting involved with these people, and at a place called the White Horse Inn, which is kind of cool. There was a White Horse Inn when I grew up. And I took my prom date to the White Horse Inn when I was a kid, just a high school kid. That was the dinner I took her to. Her name was Julie, and I took her to the White Horse Inn. But anyway, in fact, my parents had their 25th anniversary at that White Horse Inn. Well, this is a different place. This is in England. It's called the White Horse Inn, and this is where the rabble-rousers were meeting. And they kind of were really into this. And William Tyndale was one of those people, like we talked about Jerome. He was smart. He was smarter than everybody else. He's just a smart person. And he was able to understand languages really well. And he took the scriptures, he got it on fire for this, and he started translating the scriptures. And in 1523, when the English crown, that was Henry VIII, by the way, this is when Henry VIII was king, when he got word that William Tyndale was doing this, he was going to arrest him. He was even known in his day, William Tyndale, as God's outlaw, because the governments were after him to arrest him for doing this. But he translated the scriptures into the Elizabethan English language. That would be what we would think of Shakespeare's language kind of thing, Elizabethan. Elizabeth was Henry VIII's granddaughter. So anyway, nonetheless, doesn't matter. That language, that style of English of Henry VIII's time, his daughter Elizabeth's time, eventually Shakespeare's time, that English language was what William Tyndale spoke, and he translated the entire scriptures into this language of English that we can recognize. We couldn't even recognize. You go back to Wycliffe, John Wycliffe in the 1300s, you wouldn't recognize that English. You go back to the Lindisfarne Gospels, you're not going to recognize that English. But you will recognize Tyndale's English, okay? And because it's changed, but not as much. So this is, and however, it wasn't too good for him, because in 1523 he completed the New Testament. In 1530 he completed the Laws of Moses. He was working on the Old Testament. I guess he didn't complete. I said that he completed it, but I don't think he did. But he did most of this work before they finally caught him. And he went to Germany, actually. He was hiding in Germany, doing his work over there, running around from city to city to try and keep getting arrested. But he did get arrested. And it was still when the boss was Henry VIII, and they killed him for this. That's what they did. All right. But they were nice to him. Okay. They said, we're going to burn you at the stake. But since we kind of like you to some degree and we respect your intelligence and all that kind of stuff, what we're going to do is we're going to strangle you to death first, and then we're going to burn you at the stake. They still burned him at the stake, but he was already dead from strangulation before they lit the fire. All right. Now, after him, now that this really worked, though, by the way. Printing press is already around. Up until every person I mentioned before this, everything had to be handwritten. It's called a manuscript. A manuscript is a man taking one letter or one book or one whatever and rewriting it onto another piece of paper. It's called a manuscript. The people who did that were called scribes. All right, and they existed in all societies all over the place. All right, but before the printing press, which is in the 1400s, Gutenberg's Bible was the first thing printed on a printing press. By the way, the Bible was the first book ever printed on a printing press. And when this printing press was invented, now all of a sudden everybody can read just thousands of copies because you just run them off, and that is what really changed a lot of stuff. And that's what they didn't like about Tyndale, is his Bible that he translated was coming off printing press, not just handwritten. So it took forever to do the next one and the next one. No, now we're just printing them, and they're getting out everywhere, and people all over England are reading it, and it's having a big impact. They didn't like it. They arrest him. Bang. Well, he's dead now. Henry VIII's dead now. His daughter Elizabeth reigned for a long, long time. In fact, I think she was the longest reigning monarch until Victoria, who was the longest reigning monarch until Elizabeth II. I believe that's how that worked. But anyway, nonetheless, that's not the point. She was queen for a long time, but she dies, and she had no kids. So a relative of hers, who was the King of Scotland, named James V, becomes King James I of England. And this is in the 1600s, 1603. And when he comes over down from Scotland and starts ruling in England, because Scotland's north of England, same island but north. So when James comes down and takes over, there's a lot of political intrigue, as there always is. It doesn't matter what era, but this intrigue had a lot to do with the Puritans that had come into power, and eventually there's the Roundheads, and there's the Cavaliers, and all this other stuff that's going to happen. But there's a lot of political intrigue. So what he does is he tries to get on people's good side, and he authorizes the Bible now to be. Remember, all these other people got killed for translating the Bible in the common language, but these Puritans and everybody, they want a Bible. They want one. They were using one called the Geneva Bible, and everything. Our pilgrims, when they came over in the 1620, they came over with the Geneva Bible. That's the one they used. But anyway, that translation into the common language of the people, because now, once again, you can't speak ancient Greek, you don't speak ancient Hebrew, you need the Bible in your own language. And they got it in their own language. But now he authorizes a very scholarly work. They hire 54 men to translate the scriptures, and they worked on it from 1604 till 1611 when it was completed. and authorized and finalized. They worked on it all those years, and that was 54 different men that spoke Hebrew, spoke Greek, and spoke Latin, and they used all those versions, even the like Jerome's Latin Vulgate, and they worked on everything they could. The Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament, which was done like before Jesus's time. They worked on the Hebrew. They used all that stuff. That's why it took so long. They did an absolutely scholarly work. In fact, it would undoubtedly be the most scholarly work ever achieved in translation up to that point in history, the King James version of the Bible. And King James had nothing to do with it, by the way. He just authorized it and paid for it. That's the only thing. The 54 scholars were the one that did this. And when it was authorized in 1611, eventually it took off. And eventually that became the language of the Bible. I mean, people all over English-speaking world, that's what they did. They read their King James version of the Bible. All right. Well, that brings us to all the older stuff. But what about modern stuff? What about these modern Bibles? Well, we're all those things came about because people's languages change. We no longer speak ancient Hebrew. We no longer speak Koine Greek. We no longer speak Elizabethan English. We do not speak the language of Shakespeare. People don't do it. Okay, we can read it, we can understand it, we can go to the play and everything else, but we don't, in our common language, we don't do that. And the Bible wasn't written in flowery language. The Bible in its original form was written in the language of the people that lived at that time, okay, by people who lived at that time. And so that's all it was. And so in the 20th century, there's some in between, but I'm going to move forward to the 20th century. We have some really good translations of the Bible. Okay, now why? Why did they start doing that? Well, because they kind of needed to, really, to get the common person to be able to read the Bible and understand it. So in 1971, over 50 people worked on the Bible, and they were scholars, and they worked on this thing, and they used a thing called formal equivalence translation. Now, formal equivalence translation would be something that's as close to you can get from one language to another, word for word. Okay? That's formal equivalence. So as much as you can do, we want to make it as close to the original as we can, and then but in the language of today, or in the language of not just today, but in another language. So they had the people that worked on this said that we have a fourfold aim, and I'm going to read what they are because I don't really want to mess it up. They said, 1, we want to be true to the original Hebrew and Greek. Number 2, we want to be grammatically correct, which, by the way, is really important. I didn't understand that growing up. Boy, I did not. I thought grammar was stupid. I did okay in school. I mean, I wasn't a bad student or anything, but I did not understand why we needed to know all this stuff about commas and paragraphs and all that. Why do you capitalize this? I didn't care, and I thought it was stupid. But then I grew old, and I became a cop. And when I was a cop, I would write reports when I'd arrest people or whatever, but especially when you arrest people. So you write a report when you arrest people. That person fights it. They go to court. And now the prosecuting attorney has a copy of your report. The prosecuting attorney is usually not usually. They always are a college-educated person. The defense attorney gets to read a copy of your report. The defense attorney is also a college-educated person. The judge can read a copy of your report. Okay? A judge is also a college-educated person. And if you don't know what you're doing and you don't put your grammar in the proper place, you actually say the opposite sometimes of what you mean. So grammar is important. And let me tell you, a good defense attorney will tear you up on stand if you don't spell well, if you don't use proper grammar. They will make you look like a not intelligent human in front of a jury. And they do it on purpose because they're trying to get their client off. I don't blame them for doing that. It's up to you to do it right. And it wasn't until I became a cop that I realized how important grammar was. Because if you don't put the comma in the right place, you can actually mean the exact opposite thing. Anyway, nonetheless, he said, true to the original Hebrew and Greek, grammatically correct, understandable by the reader, and they shall give Jesus Christ his proper place, the place the word gave him. That was the 4 things. So the 4 aims of the New American Standard that was translated in 1971 is that it's true to the original Hebrew and Greek, grammatically correct, understandable to the modern reader, and Jesus is given his proper place that the Bible gives him. Okay, that's what our focus is on. So that was the New American Standard, probably still the most word for word accurate version of that you can read. If you don't speak Hebrew and Greek, you want to know exactly what it said, word for word almost, get a New American Standard Bible. That will be good. Now, the next one I'm going to talk about is the NIV, or the New International Version. Now, that was translated in 1978. Now, this took 15 years with 120 scholars working on this thing, okay? And they came from everybody. They were Anglicans, Baptists, Catholics, Assembly of God people, Christian Reformed people, Lutherans, Presbyterians. They were from different countries. They were from the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. If you were an English-speaking country, you probably got a say-so in this thing called the New International Version. And they did not do something that we would call dynamic equivalence. They did another way, which was more an idea of, it's not 100%, but it's like, I'm not going to go word for word. I'm going to go idea for idea. Okay, I hope that made sense. I'm sorry. Formal equivalence is word for word. Formal equivalence. Dynamic equivalence is idea for idea. And even though they split the difference, they went more for the dynamic equivalence idea. So that they read it in the original. Now, these are scholars, and they read it in the original, and then they translate it into the language of the people today. And they're saying, what did they mean by this? And it's not just one person's idea. There's a whole bunch of scholars working on this together. And they came up with, and they're from different denominations, from different countries even. And they came up with what we now know as the New International Version. It's by far the biggest selling version of the Bible, except for the King James. King James is still number one. And actually, I use the King James, by the way, but I don't think it's the best translation or anything. I think that some of these newer ones had more scholarship. Okay, we're going to move forward to there's something that's called the New Living Bible, the New Living Translation, NLT. The New Living Translation was done in 1996. Now, it was in response to the Living Bible. The Living Bible came out in the 60s, I believe, and 70s, I think it was 60s. But anyway, this was a guy's work. He loved God, he loved Jesus, and he decided to translate the scriptures into the language, a modern language, so his children could understand it instead of reading it in the King James. That's what it came about. And it took off. Billy Graham liked it, and Billy Graham started giving out these living Bibles at his crusades. People really started getting into it, and it was a very successful endeavor. And people could read it, and it's good. There's nothing wrong with the Living Bible. But it's kind of one guy, and it's not a scholarly work, and he's not a Greek and Hebrew scholar that I know of, and maybe he was, I don't know. But it doesn't really matter. That's not the point. It's one guy's work. Well, what they did was they took his work, which was very important. God used his work tremendously, but they decided to make it a scholarly effort. And they had over 90 scholars. They took and used the same idea, which is the dynamic equivalence, like the NIV, but even further. And they made it so it's completely understandable the way we speak now. They didn't worry about too much about the way they spoke when the Bible was written. They more the way we speak now. They took what they meant then and they put it in super common language of today. Okay. And by the way, they did a darn good job. The New Living Translation is really, really good. So, and over 90 scholars worked on it, so they knew what they were doing. Well, then I'm going to move forward. Okay. But by the way, that might be the easiest one to understand. I'm just going to say New Living Translation, probably as far as scholarly works into our language from the original, probably the easiest for most people to understand. My pastor uses it all the time, and I like that he does, because it's easy to, when he reads it right out of that, it's just like he's just talking today. All right, there's one called the ESV, English Standard Version, that was translated in 2001. And this one also had over 100 scholars. And there's one called it's called the ESV Study Bible. It's sold 250 million copies since it was, brought out. I mean, that's a lot of copies, all right? And New York Times bestseller list only needs 5,000, 250 million, okay? Because people use the ESV Study Bible, and they should because it's a really good translation. And anyway, they went back more like the New American Standard. They went to more formal equivalents as far as translation work. They did not go idea for idea. They're trying to go word for word, but making it in our modern language, all right? And the study Bible that they came up with in this translation is incredible. Great notes, everything. You can learn so much from it, okay? So read the Bible, but you can also read notes from really educated people about it, and that's good. That's why it sold so many copies, I think. But that's called the ESV. All these translations, why do we need them? Well, we don't. You can go read Hebrew and Greek if you want to, but I don't really want to. So I need a language in a Bible in my language. I personally use all of these. There's something called the Bible Hub, and you can read it in different translations right down on the same page. Look up a verse, and on Bible Hub, it'll have all these different translations. Really good. But we do need to have a scholarly work, and the reason that we need that, I think it's important instead of just one guy's idea what the Bible says, is because once again, I'm going to bring up my COP time, Investigation Bible, studying the Bible through the eyes of a retired law enforcement officer. Well, when I was a law enforcement officer, sometimes I would arrest somebody or investigate a crime with somebody. Maybe they were the witness. It doesn't mean that I was arrested everybody I talked to. Maybe they were a witness, but they didn't speak English. Now, if they spoke Spanish, which was common in where I worked, then that wasn't so bad. I speak COP Spanish. I can get it by. Or I can have another law enforcement officer that's an officially translating person. They actually get paid to translate. We have quite a few of those guys that speak Spanish, and I mean not just my little simple what we called COP Spanish, but they converse in Spanish, and you could have them translate, and that was fine. Well, what if they speak a language like Cantonese? Okay, how many people do I know that speak Chinese at all, either Mandarin or Cantonese? I don't actually know anybody who does. I've got a pretty good friend who speaks Vietnamese because he's from Vietnam, but I don't know anybody who speaks Cantonese. And there was certainly nobody on the department that spoke Cantonese. So now what am I going to do? Well, we have a system in place where we call dispatch. Dispatch calls a Cantonese interpreter, and then through the modern technology, magic of modern technology, I can speak to this person on the phone, and all three of us can talk. I can ask the interpreter a question. The interpreter asks the person the question. The person tells the interpreter the answer in their language, and they tell me the answer. Now, that worked in any language. We have everybody, man. We got everybody. And that worked swell. But every defense attorney that sees this when they're trying to defend their client, what they do is they notice that and they try and poke holes in that. Like, this is just one person. What if they didn't interpret it properly? Well, I don't know. How am I going to know if they're interpreting it properly? I don't speak that language. There was a few years ago, there was a lady that was doing sign language at some conference. I don't even remember what it was, a political thing or whatever. I don't remember, but she was doing the hand signals or hand things like she's interpreting the speech with sign language, but she's not speaking any sign language because she doesn't know it. And of course, people that understood sign language were like, she's not even saying anything. So you don't want her translating the scriptures or even translating my conversation with the person I'm either interviewing or going to arrest. You want somebody that's an expert in this field, but it's still only one person. So imagine if a defense attorney saw that 5 people that were all experts in the languages, in that language, interpreted with me and made sure it was all exactly right. Well, they're not even going to use that as an option. There's no possibility they're going to argue that these 5 people got it wrong that speak this language. Okay, it's not even 2 people. It's just not going to happen. One person, they actually do try that, but a few people, it's not going to happen. Well, how about 120 people like the NIV? 100 people like the ESV? We know that translation is as close to the original as it can possibly be. Now, some of them are using dynamic equivalents, idea for idea. Some are using formal equivalents, word for word. But you can read both of them in our English language and get a really good idea what the original meant. Okay? So it is just simply an excuse if you say, I don't even know if we can read the Bible what they really meant in the first place. One, I'm going to finish right now. I went a little long here. One, we know what languages they were written in, Hebrew and Greek, and a little Aramaic. Two, we have people that can speak those languages quite well and translate them into our modern language. People have been doing it the whole time the Bible's been around. Back in Jerome's day, even before Jerome, King James' day, even a little before then, and now modern day. It doesn't matter. You speak this language. In fact, remember I brought up that guy named John Wycliffe? He lived in the 1300s. There's something called the Wycliffe Bible Society. And what they have done, they've been around since the 20th century, and they do something amazing. They go into a people group that do not have a written language. They learn their language. They then write their language into an alphabet. They then teach those people to read their own language because they didn't have a written, language. There's different places like Papua New Guinea and stuff where this was the case. They teach them to read in their new language or in their original language, and then they translate the Bible into that language so that people can read the Bible. It's called the Wycliffe Bible Society, named after John Wycliffe from the 1300s. I mean, that's incredible. I don't care where you're on this earth. You can read it. If you speak Cantonese, there's Cantonese Bibles that were translated from the original into Cantonese. If you speak Farsi, that's the language of the Iranians. There's Bibles that are translated from the original Hebrew and Greek into Farsi. If you speak German, there's Bibles translated from the original Hebrew and Greek into German. Same thing with Spanish, original languages into Spanish. Same thing with English. And I just went over a few of those versions. There's more. But find one, read it. You are reading what the original people meant to say. What I think God wanted those people to say. And I think what God wants you to hear. So anyway, there's the story of the Bible, kind of a brief history of translations of that said book, the Holy Bible. And I hope you enjoyed it. We're now going to be 10:10 on this episode, and I hope to see you again